how are you? This is Cliff Cumber, and welcome to Comics Unencumbered, a very occasional podcast in which each few days, or weeks, or when I can be bothered, I ramble about an independent comic creator or comic I find interesting, even inspiring, or maybe just that little bit disturbing. So recently I tweeted my followers to ask if I had $100, what indie comic titles would they recommend? The caveat being they couldn't recommend their own work. Now, at the time, I didn't think it would get much attention. It's Twitter, after all, but I got dozens of cracking suggestions, enough to bankrupt me and populate a whole year's worth, a whole season's worth of comic Unencumbered episodes. And what that told me is that, one, the indie comics community is incredibly generous about and passionate when it comes to their colleagues in the industry. And the prevailing feeling, at least from the handful of replies I got, actually more than a handful, was that a rising tide lifts all boats. So two, the other takeaway, one of the three, is that the community is enormous, and there's always a pocket of creators across the world who are producing work of incredible quality, and that community is largely not accessed by me, or I'm unaware of it, which pains me because I like to know about these things. And whereas these artists and creators and writers, comic book people, may be well known in the community that they've built, they may not be known to the broader world, which is a real shame because there's some very intelligent and insightful work being put out there. So again, their work deserves to be shared more broadly, and I think to a degree that's, and I say this with love, our communities, independent comics communities, can be siloed and self-contained because there's only, so many people who can be involved in one community and another community, and when you're talking about independent comics, I mean, then that's an even smaller audience. So anyhow, if we, as a group of creators, all band together, then we're more likely to be able to make our work available to a broader community, especially if we choose to share that work through social media. So here's the third point. These creators, they have a fan base, our creators have a fan base, they all believe this work should be shared. So we should be doing our utmost to share this work and the work of other creators. And I know there is a large community of people out there, certainly in the UK comics scene, through the Awesome Comics podcast and other independent creators who do yeoman's work in sharing the wealth. Anyhow, but we should also be trying to reach out to audiences and communities that aren't a part of our particular bubble. We should always be looking for opportunities, and I think other creators are always looking for opportunities to share their work more broadly. And so for me, having a little podcast like this, I should be using that platform, that voice, in order to try and boost works that come my way. And I try and do that on social media, but I have neglected Comics Unencumbered for a little while, and it's time to put that right. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to relaunch Comics Unencumbered with this episode and devote the majority of what remains of this season version 2.1, to the books I learned about in that Twitter thread. Now, that's not to say that I don't reserve the right to throw in a couple of unrelated books to that tweet that I have read recently and loved, and I've got a couple coming up that I've just discovered just out of pure luck. But let's see if we can't bring a little attention to these excellent comics, and in doing so, broaden our horizons. Enough of the premise. Let's begin. Today is a collection of Lessons and Hauntings, or just Hauntings, by Lise April Amelia, and this was published in 2021. Hauntings is a collection of short autobiographical ghost stories. It's a comic about living, walking, and running in and around the city of Bath. And I take that from Lise's webpage. The digital copy is 49 pages with 9 self-contained stories told in 2-panel setup per page. Each story is about 4 pages apiece, and the PDF only costs about, well, in American money, $4 or €2, if you prefer. You might remember Europe. It was a place that we all used to be able to go. Anyhow, those 9 stories are Sarah, Carol, Under the Hill, Sally in the Woods, The 13th Stone, The Spire in the Valley, It's in the Trees, and I really hope that is a nod to Kate Bush, because that will add a star to an already 5-star recommendation. Julius's House, and Embers. One of the things I'm going to talk about quite a lot probably is the atmosphere or the mise en scène of this particular work. And with the exception of one story, Julius's House, everything takes place outside in nature. So it's all about Lise walking around or running, as she mentioned in her on her webpage. And it's all in and around Bath, which for those in America who are not necessarily schooled on the different cities in England, Bath is an ancient city, predates Roman times, and has been around for a very long time. And it's a beautiful city. If you've ever been there, it's well worth going. Anyhow, so with Hauntings, Lise indicates a degree of horror, and horror within the natural landscape. And I say that with all due caution, because horror is not necessarily the emotion that's evoked here. I feel it's in a sort of folklore horror vein, in the style of sort of M.R. James, that sort of teasing, subtle, pervasive sense of unease, the kind that's driven, from our limbic mind, of something that is seen, or a location, or the kind of liminal space that you can find yourself in, for example, in nature when you're in a forest or in the midst of a fog. So, really, the stories all build in their sense of discomfort or disconcertment or unease. And Lise walks up to this line of reveal with each story, but doesn't cross it. And you will notice that these short pieces are often truncated. And part of the craft Lise brings to this story is that each segment doesn't feel forcibly abbreviated. She generously allows the reader's imagination to free fall into interpretation. I liken it to kind of walking off a cliff in a fog. It's that sudden sort of stop and drop, into your own imagination of an own interpretation of what this story could be. So this is a very psychological book, I find, and it's beautifully drawn and inscribed, and it teases out this sense of unease from you, from using tools of distorted perceptions, or of surroundings. And in only one story, really, do we actually see a ghost. That's not a spoiler. And that's in the story of Lisa's childhood, relayed by a nan in Julius's house, which is interesting because I think, that's the one slightly different story from the tenor of all the others. And what it is, it's a remembrance of what her nan, I believe, a story her nan might have told her. So it differs very slightly in that sense. And if I'm to liken her stories to anybody, I would say they're in the same vein as Sarah Gordon, another favourite of mine who's on the sort of sight unseen, guaranteed buy list. And Sarah uses a lot of folk horror in her work, but it's not a perfect comparison. Sarah's stories have very definitive aspects of the natural and supernatural, and she pushes very hard. She leans into the violent consequences of some of this natural horror and the choices that are made. However, the commonalities are, you will find it's sort of the natural subjects. Both creators twist the natural everyday world to create that sense of unease, that sense of discomfort. And as I mentioned before, there are qualities of M.R. James to it. If you're not familiar with his work, he was an expert at these kind of brooding but building horror stories. And in those, it's what's not shown that's disturbing, the possibilities that are left to your imagination, the conclusions you draw from some of the things that you see. And it's the sense of the undefinable, which is just out of reach. And that is what made this so powerful to me, because what Lisa portrays is something that I myself have encountered walking in England when I visited recently, especially on the Cornish coast. It's the sense of location, the weather, everything builds into a feeling of being observed. The landscape just has a sense of consciousness to it, and you might find that's not always a benevolent feeling. The sense of unease always can arise in you in certain circumstances, and your presence in these locations you might feel are not always welcome. As an aside, I don't really get the same sense when walking in America. I think it's something to do with the history of England and the fact that it has been a lived-in place for so long. And America just, has been lived in, but not in the same way. It hasn't been so broadly populated. It's still an area of large open spaces. But, Britain just and other European countries have that sense of having been occupied. And in that occupation, there's been a transference of the personalities or the feelings or of the people onto the environment. At least that's my subjective feeling. Whether or not that's actually true, I don't know. But anyhow, back to Hauntings. As I mentioned, each story builds on the other layers with common themes, nature, movement, a vague sense out there of something. And as a whole, it is beautifully drawn and very evocative of the sometimes eeriness of transitional places or times of day. Highly recommend this one. You can get it on Lisa's Gumroad page. I will put the link in the notes, but for sure, pick up, if you can't get the printed copy, and I'm not sure if there are still some available, get the PDF. It's well worth the read, and for a steal. It's such a great price for such a good book. Can probably almost guarantee that if I was going to do a best of list for this year, this would be on it. And there you have it, an absolute little gem for you to read there with this edition of Comics Unencumbered. And that brings us to the end. And I'll just say, take care of yourself, take care of others, and I hope you have a good one until we're back again. Once again, you can find me on Twitter at CGCumber or on Instagram at the same address, and I'd appreciate you giving me a follow. Thank you.